Yeah,
For what?
for the second half.
Yeah, they're gonna bring it to us later.
Okay. All right.
So
Yeah, I got it.
For Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Max Outman. There are 1.5 million active warrants for minor crimes in New York. Today, district attorneys from the 5 boroughs are announcing plans to begin throwing out many of them. The offenses, ranging from unpaid parking tickets to disorderly conduct, come in large part from years of aggressive stop and frisk and broken windows policies. In an interview with Brian Lair, Mayor de Blasio explained the decision, and he compared it with the recent immigration controversies under the Trump administration. In Queens, an exhibit at the Museum of Image and Art has been shut down after becoming what one museum spokesperson describes as a flashpoint for violence. Okay. The exhibit, He Will Not Divide Us, encouraged passersby to repeat that phrase into a wall mounted security camera in criticism of Donald Trump. Since its debut inauguration day, though, the exhibit has the exhibit has increasingly become a site of confrontation. The controversy culminated 2 weeks ago in the arrest of Transformers star Shia LaBeouf, one of the installation's creators. LaBeouf responded this morning with a single tweet: "The museum has abandoned us." The museum.
yeah. Sorry, I was not giggling at you. I was giggling at Shia LaBeouf.
Woo!
Yay!
That was very well constructed. They have a. So they know we don't have the second half of the script. Okay. Okay. Mics are on, you know.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's February 10th. I'm Kristen Schwab.
And I'm Mike Elson-Rooney. New York State is considering a controversial testing method that uses DNA of family members to solve crimes.
It basically says if you're related to someone who's convicted of a crime, you get less rights.
The MTA is asking commuters what they want when the L train shuts down. Some are optimistic.
I think that when the L train finally comes back into service, people are going to look at these and say, hey, this is actually kind of better.
New York's Silicon Alley, not to be confused with Silicon Valley, is expanding to the Bronx, and tech companies want to bring opportunities where they didn't used to exist.
My parents brought me home one day a computer when I was 10 years old. They put it in my room, and I had to figure it out.
Protests continue against Trump's travel ban. Millennials have a love-hate relationship with Valentine's Day. And we take a look at nuclear energy in New York State. All that and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Janine Herbst. President Trump is defending his call for a temporary travel ban on refugees and visitors from 7 largely Muslim countries. That a day after a federal appeals court ruled against the administration. NPR's Scott Horsley reports Trump says he'll do whatever is necessary to keep the country safe.
Trump believes his tough talk on national security during the campaign is a key reason he was elected. And he says his concern about a possible terrorist attack has only grown during the 3 weeks he's been in office. Trump cites that concern to justify his call for a temporary travel ban. And while a federal appeals court was not persuaded by that argument, Trump told reporters the legal fight is not over.
We will continue to go through the court process, and ultimately I have no doubt that we'll win that particular case.
The president also hinted at additional security steps that could be adopted next week. He didn't elaborate, but one option would be to rewrite the travel ban more narrowly in order to pass constitutional muster. Scott Horsley, NPR News, the White House.
Democrats on Capitol Hill are calling for National Security Advisor Mike Flynn to be suspended or even fired. That follows new reports that Flynn discussed U.S. sanctions against Russia with that country's ambassador back in December, weeks before President Trump took office. NPR's Mary Louise Kelly has more.
The White House has acknowledged Flynn spoke to Ambassador Sergei Kislyak around the time new sanctions were imposed on Russia. The question is what Flynn said. New allegations, first reported by the Washington Post, are that Flynn hinted the Kremlin might expect a reprieve from sanctions once Trump took office. Adam Schiff, top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, says if that's true, Flynn should no longer serve. Other Democrats say Flynn should be suspended while an investigation plays out. Last month, Vice President Mike Pence denied Flynn discussed sanctions with the Russians. The White House says that assertion was based on Flynn's account of the conversation. Mary Louise Kelly, NPR News, Washington.
The University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment climbed to a 13-year high last month, boding well for spending and economic growth. But as Steve Beckner reports, its latest survey of households yielded an unexpected setback.
In a preliminary reading for February, the index plunged nearly 3 points to 95.7. Although people feel better off financially, expectations for wage gains are down. Survey Director Richard Curtin says confidence remains quite favorable, but says there is a partisan divide in how Americans view economic prospects.
Steve Beckner reporting. On Wall Street, just before the close, the Dow was up 96 points at 20,269. The Nasdaq up 18 points at 5734. The S&P 500 up 8 points at 2316. You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
For Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Max Outman. There are 1.5 million active warrants for minor crimes in New York. Today, district attorneys from the 5 boroughs are announcing plans to begin throwing out many of them. The offenses, ranging from unpaid parking tickets to disorderly conduct, come in large part from years of aggressive stop-and-frisk and broken windows policies. In an interview with Brian Lair, Mayor de Blasio explained the decision, and he compared it with the recent immigration controversies under the Trump administration.
Very low-level crimes, small possession of small amount of marijuana possession, minor traffic offenses, these kind of things, quality of life offenses, littering, et cetera. People should not be deported for that.
In Queens, an exhibit at the Museum of Image and Art has been shut down after becoming what one museum spokesperson describes as a flashpoint for violence. The exhibit, "He Will Not Divide Us," encouraged passersby to repeat that phrase into a wall-mounted security camera in criticism of Donald Trump. Since its debut Inauguration Day, though, the exhibit has increasingly become a site of confrontation. That controversy culminated 2 weeks ago in the arrest of Transformers star Shia LaBeouf, one of the installation's creators. LaBeouf responded this morning with a single tweet: "The museum has abandoned us." The museum, however, called it a serious and ongoing public safety hazard that had to be shut down. City snowplows are out clearing the streets today following yesterday's record-breaking snowfall. While many criticized the city's response to last year's blizzard, the streets were cleared much quicker this afternoon. All this snow removal does come with a price tag, though. A recent report by the Comptroller's Office stated that the average cost of snow removal across the city is $1.8 million per inch. That means snow removal this year could potentially cost as much as $16 million. This is Max Hauptman, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Kristen Schwab.
And I'm Mike Elson-Rooney.
Yesterday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California rejected President Trump's efforts to lift his travel ban from 7 majority Muslim countries. The judges challenged Trump's claim that the court should stay out of the process and ruled that there were no immediate threat to national security to warrant the ban.
But Trump has vowed to keep fighting, and so have a slew of human rights organizations. Rebecca Scott brings us this story from a protest today in Midtown Manhattan.
It's a bitterly cold day in New York City, but the crowd assembled on the corner of 5th Avenue and 60th Street isn't deterred by the temperature. They're here for Amnesty International's Stand Up to Trump rally.
Oh, Trump will make us great again. Hear the bigots celebrate again. Prison builders salivate again. Trump will make us great again.
That's Alice Sutter, one of the attendees. She's singing a song she wrote for the Raging Grannies, a group of elderly women who get together to attend protests like the one Amnesty International is hosting today.
We're the New York Metro Raging Grannies, and they're Raging Grannies. They started in Vancouver, and they've spread all over the place.
Amnesty International is among the many human rights organizations that have found themselves busier than usual during President Trump's first weeks in office. Today, activists are spending their Friday lunch break marching to Trump Tower to let the president know exactly what they think about his travel ban.
Part of me wants to appeal to him on a humanity level, and I just don't know if that's possible. We need a leader, not a tweeter.
Deanne Gorman was an active member of Amnesty International in the 90s. She began attending meetings again in November after Trump was elected. She says that Amnesty International is just one of the organizations on her radar.
I mean, I'm on a lot of mailing lists right now, and it's hard to keep up with everything. I've created a new folder called Resist. I'm just taking a lunch break for action.
Once the protesters reach Trump Tower, the plan is to place a couple of hundred welcome mats around the border of the building. Eric Ferrero, one of the protest organizers, says that this is to symbolize what America is all about.
I think we're here to really talk about compassion and respect and the welcoming and affirming spirit that America was founded on and that most Americans feel toward refugees of all backgrounds. And I think, unfortunately, President Trump doesn't seem to understand that.
Ferrero says the court's decision to strike down the travel ban was an encouraging sign for human rights activists, but it's not enough.
We want Congress to step in immediately and rescind the Muslim ban. It's discriminatory, it's dangerous. Even with the court order in effect, we're still hearing from people who are being stopped by Border Patrol agents, questioned and detained.
Come to me, refugee, may you know peace at last.
The outcome of Trump's travel ban remains uncertain, but one thing is for sure. The street that leads to Trump Tower will be well worn by the feet of activists, both young and old, before this fight is over.
By my light in the night, welcome now to our shores.
Rebecca Scott, Columbia Radio News.
So what's next with the court's unanimous decision on the travel ban? My co-host Kristen spoke with Thomas Lee, a constitutional lawyer and professor at Fordham Law, about how he interprets the decision.
there's a distinction between them saying that there's no security threat and them saying that there's no evidence of it. And I think that the opinion indicates more toward the latter. And there's a legal question whether in this kind of context, because of immigration and the federal government's power to control entry, that there's an argument out there that the courts don't have any right to review what the executive department says. And the court said, well, that's not true. So they did say that. They said that they have a right to review and that the government hasn't presented any evidence of a legitimate security threat. The court was very careful, the appellate court was very careful to say, we don't know if the government's ban based on discrimination against religion. It actually said more about how, well, given that there's an undifferentiated ban on various kinds of aliens, including permanent resident aliens and people who have connections to the United States, that in those cases they might be deprived of a liberty interest in violation of the Due Process Clause, but they actually didn't decide that there was a religious discrimination claim yet.
So you were talking about the future. Where do you think this executive order goes next?
The whole proceeding that we've just witnessed was in response to something called a temporary restraining order on the travel ban, which the district court had issued. And the next step is something that's called a preliminary injunction. And that's a more lasting kind of injunction or stopping of the travel ban. What's going to happen with regards to the temporary restraining order, which the Ninth Circuit decided on yesterday, the government will probably appeal that to the United States Supreme Court, and it's rare for the United States Supreme Court to grant in such an instance, and I think my prediction there is when government files its papers to the Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit's decision that was released yesterday will be affirmed by an equally divided vote. So then the action will go back to the trial court for what I just described to you as the preliminary injunction hearing.
So if Trump does revise his order, in your opinion, what do you think are his strongest arguments if this goes to the Supreme Court?
He's definitely got to clarify that long-term permanent residents, anyone with a student visa or a worker visa who can't get back into the United States, or people that have close relatives in the United States, such as a parent, a child, are not affected. And the other thing he can do is to make clearer, I mean, it could be based on sensitive intelligence data, but if it is, then he could ask for a closed hearing, but he's got to present more evidence as to why he detected some kind of foreign terrorist threat from this list of countries that justified the ban.
That was Thomas Lee, a constitutional lawyer and professor at Fordham Law. Thank you, Thomas.
You're welcome.
This is Uptown Radio. The introduction of forensic DNA testing fundamentally changed criminal investigations. The practice has even led to some exonerations for those wrongfully convicted. Now, a new method of testing, familial DNA, is under debate, but it's controversial.
Catherine Sullivan heads to a hearing at City Hall where government officials, civil rights advocates, and citizens faced off about whether to make the legal practice in New York State.
Phil Fadrano's daughter, Karina, was jogging in the Howard Beach neighborhood of Queens last August when she was brutally assaulted and murdered. In front of an array of television cameras and teary-eyed listeners, Fadrano urged others to put themselves in his shoes.
I ask you, what would you want to be done to find the person that just ruined your life? And I'm going to answer that question for you. The answer is everything they can. Let's do everything.
Everything, for the Fadranos, includes familial DNA searching. Familial DNA works like this. Imagine your brother or father was arrested in connection with a violent crime. Familial searching allows investigators to search databases for potential matches not just to his DNA, but to yours as well, making you a potential suspect based solely on your family members. So far, this practice hasn't been allowed in New York, but the State Commission on Forensic Science could change that. Today, they're hearing public comments on the issue. Erin Murphy is a law professor at New York University and an expert in DNA testing. She's critical of the search.
Even as a legislative matter, this is something that New Yorkers shouldn't approve. It's hard to walk away from a technology that could solve crimes. Of course, everyone's in favor of closing cases and finding perpetrators of crimes, but this is one that really comes at a high cost.
Murphy feels those costs greatly outweigh the potential good. unfairly incriminating mostly Black and Latino families.
And it discriminates among our population. It basically says if you're related to someone who's convicted of a crime, you get less rights. You're automatically a suspect now in any crime.
Familial searching is allowed in 10 states, including California, where it's helped solve rape and murder cases. But courts in Maryland and Washington, D.C. outlawed the technique. They say it's invasion of privacy. Allison Lewis of the Legal Aid Society agrees.
We think it's disproportionately targeting communities who have been over-policed to begin with. We think there's an equal protection problem, much like stop and frisk. We don't think it's an efficient use of law enforcement resources.
Queens Assistant District Attorney Eric Rosenbaum says these risks are worth it.
Without prompt action on familial searching, killers, rapists, and those who perpetrate other violent crimes and serious offenses will remain at large, the public will remain in danger, and the suffering of other victims and their families will be amplified by the inability to solve their cases.
He says police should use every tool available.
But we cannot always rely on a strike of lightning to solve crime. And we shouldn't rely on it when sound scientific tools exist.
But just last week, NYPD arrested a suspect in Karina's murder without the help of familial DNA. The State Commission isn't deciding on this today. Some say they shouldn't even have the power to make the decision, that it should be left to the legislature. For now, police in New York will have to rely on traditional DNA testing and old-fashioned shoe leather investigating. Catherine Sullivan, Columbia Radio News.
Affordable housing is a major issue in Mayor de Blasio's bid for re-election next year. The main way to get affordable housing, according to de Blasio, is to give developers tax breaks for providing it. But enforcement has been tricky, and a recent audit says the city may have given away more than $2 billion in these tax credits, with little to show for it. Now, Governor Cuomo has proposed a new bill on the table. Max Hauptman reports.
On Fleet Place in downtown Brooklyn, a 32-story condominium is going up. A lottery is open until March for nearly 30 affordable rate apartments. Those who win could pay as little as $850 a month for a studio, and the developer will get a tax break to make sure this happens. Now there is a new proposal to manage how these tax breaks are regulated. Erica Buckley is a former chief of the New York Attorney General's Real Estate Finance Bureau. She now specializes in real estate law and government practice.
So this just makes the previous version of the law that was enacted effective. So there's, pretty much like an affordability requirement across the board for most projects.
Affordable New York, as Governor Cuomo calls his plan, replaces the old tax exemption New York developers could apply for if they were building in the outer boroughs or northern Manhattan. According to developers, these exemptions create incentive to build, but affordable housing advocate Jeff Macklin disagrees.
Back in the 70s and 80s, there was a dearth of affordable housing, and you needed some lever to get the real estate community and developers to build affordable housing. Now it's more of a gimme, a give back, a perk for the development community.
These perks expired last year, and since then the city, state, and developers have been at an impasse. Now, in a move that some see as a challenge to Mayor de Blasio, the governor's office is taking the lead in putting forward a proposal that offers a few changes to the old tax law. Buckley says a key part of the new law is keeping a closer eye on developers.
And that requires both, city and state agencies to work together to make sure that laws are properly adhered to and that, benefits are properly administered.
In the past, developers that applied for the 421A exemption were granted tax subsidies as soon as construction began. Under Affordable New York, those benefits only kick in once a building is complete and tenants have moved in. Two city councilmen want to ensure that the city conducts annual audits of 20% of buildings receiving tax subsidies to ensure compliance. Buckley says these proposals would be critical in ensuring that the city is able to guarantee affordable housing for its residents.
I'm a firm believer in, we need to keep building. We need more housing because we have so many people that are underserved.
Governor Cuomo's proposal has met with some pushback, though. A recent press release from the mayor's office reads, "Albany needs to make good on the reforms we secured to the old broken 421A program. No tax breaks for luxury condos." Tom Waters is an affordable housing policy analyst and agrees that providing affordable housing remains a problem for the program.
So it's not very affordable. It's not really relevant to meeting the city's major housing needs.
Waters also adds that, despite the recent proposals by the city council, enforcement remains an issue.
There's been very little enforcement over the years, partly because the city and state agencies each think it's the other one's job.
Until the state assembly votes on Governor Cuomo's proposal, Providing affordable housing for New Yorkers will remain a contentious issue. Max Outman, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. New Yorkers take dining out seriously, and that includes on the street. A new city council bill proposed earlier this month is pushing for street food carts to display their health grades, just like restaurants do. Melissa Cáceres reports from the Upper East Side.
Near the bottom steps of the Met Museum, Jack George waits in line at a shiny metal food cart. Vendor Elizabeth Rossi peeks out from the window to take his order.
Hi, sir. What can I get for you?
Get a jumbo hot dog, mustard, and sauerkraut.
It's lunchtime on a Thursday afternoon, and visitors sit around as local musicians play nearby. George says he likes eating street hot dogs, even though they aren't widely known for their cleanliness. He knows what New Yorkers tend to call them.
Dirty water dogs, as they're affectionately known, although I think she's grilling them there. I don't think she's boiling them.
A new bill is pushing to expand the health department's letter grade system for rating restaurants to food carts and trucks. Rossi's cart has been at this location for almost 10 years. She says she feels confident that her stand would get an A.
This is a positive, happy experience. We want you to walk away feeling that whatever you eat, you're confident you would never get sick from our food. I mean, we've never had a complaint like that ever.
Rossi says she supports customers knowing how food carts are inspected, but she's still worried about how the grading system would work for outdoor vendors. She says during regular health inspections, even the smallest detail can screw up your score.
Literally, the grade, what you're not realizing is the grade could be that I ran out of paper towels and they mark you off. The soap is out in 1 second and they mark you off. If one of the coolers is leaking the wrong way.
Michael Cohen is a city council legislative director and helped out with the bill. He says a lot of details about the grading process are still up in the air.
There'll be testimony and there'll be recommendations, I'm sure, from the health department, from the industry, and perhaps from the public that may necessitate some tweaking of the bill.
One issue at stake is how the city could afford to check out at least 3,000 food carts and trucks. Cohen says all of that would take extra time and staffing.
And if that's what the council wants to do here, then they got to be prepared to give the health department the resources to do it.
In the meantime, street food lovers will still need to place their faith in the hands of vendors like Rossi.
I have onions, sauerkraut, and relish.
No. Do you want onion sauerkraut? No sauerkraut on one, and I'm good with nothing on the other.
And the lack of grades hasn't kept visitors away. The bill has to go through the health committee before the city council gets to vote on it later this year. Melissa Cáceres, Columbia Radio News.
If the city ranked subway lines with letter grades, the L train might get an F. Commuters are already bracing themselves for January 2019, when a section of the L train will shut down for an estimated 18 months. The MTA and City Department of Transportation say the line needs major repairs due to damage from Superstorm Sandy. Now, they're holding public meetings to ask commuters what transit options they prefer. And while many dread the shutdown, some lasting transportation improvements might come of it. Camila Kerwin has more.
When it comes to how the city will manage the L train shutdown, some ideas floating around include expanding City Bike, improving service to other train lines, and making 14th Street car-free. But those options aren't a big comfort for Zachary L. Okla, who relies on the L daily.
But I know they're trying to mediate it with buses and new routes, but how it seems to go with construction in New York City, if they say it takes 3 years, it's going to be 5 or however many. Honestly, it makes me want to move away from the area.
Michael Arnone is also considering leaving the neighborhood.
I'm going to tell my landlord that my rent has to be lower or I'll go somewhere else.
This frustration is common. 300,000 people use the L to go between Brooklyn and Manhattan each day. Naima Blasco says her commute is unpredictable enough, even without a closure.
I mean, we already are seeing delays just in weekend and late night, and that's affecting me getting to work. There's not really very many options around.
I don't deny that if the L train shuts down tomorrow, it will be chaos.
That's Henry Grabar. He's written a lot about New York's subway and transportation system, and he thinks the shutdown could be just the crisis the city needs, that it might corner government officials into making big changes to accommodate disrupted commuters. For some ideas, he's looking backwards.
Our East River bridges historically, all of them used to have more rail transit than they do now. And as they switched over to car lanes, the number of crossings that was made on them every day has pretty much consistently gone down since the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
Grabar thinks more city buses and fewer cars on the Williamsburg Bridge could help make up for the loss of L train service. In fact, buses are a core part of any plan to replace the L, which means people like Wendy Pollock, a spokesperson for the Regional Plan Association, are having to think a lot about what makes buses so slow in the city. The biggest culprit? Metro cards.
I'm sure you know, you've had the experience of sitting on a bus while it's stopped and there are 30 people waiting to board, and that takes a long time, right?
One solution might be to have everyone pay for bus fare in advance, like they do on select bus service. It could even go so far as to make 14th Street open only to pedestrians, cyclists, and buses for certain parts of the day. That's right, no private cars on 14th Street. This is one of Grabar's favorite ideas.
I think that when the L train finally comes back into service, people are going to look at these emergency crisis solutions that were derived and say, hey, this is actually kind of better.
It's a long way between now and then, though, and that leaves people like Zachary L. Okla from the Bedford Avenue stop feeling apprehensive.
I would like to think that those would be enough to make everything still run smoothly, but I just don't know, and I don't want to bank on that.
The next public workshop to give the MTA and the City Department of Transportation feedback about how to manage the shutdown will take place on February 16th in Williamsburg. Camila Kerwin, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio.
Valentine's Day is coming up next week, and the National Retail Federation predicts close to $19 billion in sales of cards, candy, and flowers. But you might be surprised by who's spending the most. According to the Federation, millennials, that notoriously unromantic group of 20 and 30-year-olds, will spend an extra $40 per person on February 14th. As my co-host Kristen Schwab reports, that's because they celebrate in their own special way.
22-year-old Persia Verlin is in the greeting card aisle at CVS. It's an explosion of red and pink glitter. Mariah Carey's Always Be My Baby is blasting from the speakers.
It's really good. It's like, the jams, Valentine's jams.
Verlin is Valentine's shopping, and she's going pretty far out of her way for a special someone.
I don't know, to ship to Malaysia. I don't really know how well chocolate holds up.
Verlin's lucky person isn't a significant other. She's sending the package all the way to Malaysia, to a friend. Because to Verlin, Valentine's Day isn't really about romance.
My peers and people that I've talked to are either they don't care about Valentine's Day, or they celebrate it in alternative ways.
According to a study by YPulse, a millennial marketing and research company, 70% of those ages 18 to 34 say Valentine's is about friends and family. More than a third say they'd rather spend it with friends than with a date. Mary Lee Bliss of YPulse says millennials are a generation that doesn't like to follow social norms.
They tend to think it's an overrated holiday, probably because they're so used to how commercialized it is. That can really turn them off at times. So when they are kind of being told that they're supposed to think about something in a certain way, they'll often reinterpret things to fit their own values.
Millennials are independent, but as anyone who has been in a relationship knows, the pressure to buy on Valentine's Day can be ridiculous. It's one of the few times of year retailers can get away with charging $8.99 for a card with singing bugs. Bliss says millennials can treat Valentine's Day as a joke, but is it really only because of marketing? Psychotherapist Catherine Lee, who specializes in millennial counseling, says no. There's another reason.
Thinking about treating others on Valentine's Day is probably a way to sort of divert attention away from dating and all the frustrations that go along with finding the one.
Lee says millennials are waiting longer to get into serious relationships, especially in urban areas where young people tend to be career-driven. But dating is hard anywhere, and with that, Valentine's Day can lose its luster. Back in CVS, Verlin has picked out a Star Wars card for her friend. I joke that she's celebrating Galentine's Day, a term millennials use to show affection for their gals.
Galentine's Day. I've never done it. I guess I am doing kind of a Galentine's Day, but I don't really feel the need to call it that.
Call it what you want. This 27-year-old reporter bought a card for that one and only Galentine, Mom. Kristen Schwab, Columbia Radio News. You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
For Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Devin Brisky. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and President Donald Trump held a joint press conference this afternoon. Trump reaffirmed that the U.S. is committed to protecting Japan's security. Less clear was the future of trade after the president abruptly pulled out of the planned Trans-Pacific Partnership. Prime Minister Abe, through a translator, struck an optimistic note.
The free and fair common set of rules to be created for the free trade regime in the region, and that was the purpose of TPP, and that the importance have not changed. I myself believe that.
The press conference kicked off 2 days of talks between the two leaders. They flew to Trump's Mar-a-Lago club in Florida to play golf. Federal Reserve official Dan Tarullo announced that he will step down in early April. Tarullo has played a key role in regulating Wall Street banks, earning a reputation as one of the toughest supervisors. The move comes after Trump's executive order dismantling many of Dodd-Frank's regulatory mechanisms. This morning, Vice President Mike Pence swore in Tom Price as Health and Human Services Secretary. Price will play a key role in dismantling the Affordable Care Act under the Trump administration.
We're both confident that you will bring that experience as a physician, that experience at the state level, and that singular experience at the national level to ensure that President Trump's vision for a healthcare system in this country that works for every American will become a reality.
Price was confirmed by the Senate in the middle-of-the-night vote that split along party lines. He enters the office while facing allegations of ethics violations as a congressman. Democrats strongly opposed Price in part because of the concerns that he traded stock of companies involved in the legislation that he was shaping. 3 men and a 16-year-old girl are in custody today after officials discovered and thwarted a planned terrorist attack in France. The French Interior Ministry said that the attack was connected to ISIS. They discovered a cell phone video where the girl had pledged her allegiance to the Islamic State. As part of the raid, a homemade explosive device was obtained. An earthquake shook the Philippines, injuring at least 2 people. The 6.5 magnitude quake rolled through Surigao del Norte, approximately 8 miles northwest of the capital city. Data from the Department of Education suggests lead poisoning is a serious problem in New York City, despite a downward trend. The highest proportion of lead poisoning cases are in Borough Park, Brooklyn, and West Queens. It will be in the low 30s this evening, with temperatures in the 40s tomorrow. The 2 train is experiencing delays. Devin Brisky, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Kristen Schwab.
And I'm Mike Elson-Rooney. In January, Governor Cuomo announced plans to shut down the Indian Point Energy Center. The nuclear plant has struggled with safety violations for decades, and it's only an hour's drive from Midtown Manhattan.
But the plant also supplies a big chunk of power to New York City and the Eastern Seaboard. So how will New Yorkers replace that missing power when Indian Point closes? No one really knows. Pia Peterson has the story.
Gary Shaw and his wife Jean are both in their 60s. They're retired, which gives them time to focus on one of their passions, anti-nuclear activism.
We're right across the river from Indian Point right now. We're going to find a good spot where you can get a unobstructed view.
We're in the Shaw's car. Gary Shaw is behind the wheel, wearing a zip-up hoodie and a big jacket over a gray t-shirt that says, "We all live downstream."
There's the monster.
Indian Point is home to 2 nuclear reactors, and it's big. There are 2 huge domes and squat smokestacks on the Hudson River bank. It's just a 15-minute drive from Cortland, New York, and the Shaw's house.
No, this is our backyard.
Like the Shaws, Governor Cuomo has been trying to shut down Indian Point for over a decade. He's called it a ticking time bomb, citing concerns over multiple safety violations and the potential for a terrorist attack on a nuclear facility so close to New York City. The majority of the power it produces is sold to towns across New England, but a portion of that energy comes down to power the city. The plant says it supplies up to a quarter of the city's energy needs, though environmental groups argue that number is likely much closer to 10%. Either way, how will the city and the eastern seaboard replace those megawatts of power? Cortland County Supervisor Linda Puglisi says, well, she'd like to know too.
These are all questions we have for the governor and his staff, and so it's really disconcerting that we don't have any kind of answers or any kind of plans yet.
Puglisi has been county supervisor for 26 years. She's been known to say that during her tenure, if so much as a screw fell off the Indian Point plant, she'd get a call about it. But the decision to close the plant was made without her. Governor Cuomo's office, the plant's owner, Entergy, and Riverkeeper, an environmental nonprofit, met behind closed doors to draft and sign the paperwork. Puglisi said she felt blindsided by a decision that will affect her and her constituents. It's not just a matter of energy. The plant employs 1,200 workers in a town of just 40,000.
So we're very concerned about their jobs, what happens when the doors close.
The plant is the town's largest taxpayer. The school system receives a third of its budget from Indian Point funds. The town library and the fire department also rely on that tax revenue, and many local businesses depend on plant workers and their money to survive.
So how are we going to make up that money is a big question.
And here's another one. Puglisi says removing all the spent nuclear fuel from the plant will take years, even decades. And then there's the matter of where to store it. The U.S. currently has no facilities to store this kind of toxic nuclear waste. Governor Cuomo's office didn't respond to a request for comment. Many in the town say they hope their new energy source will be a clean one. And in the meantime, Puglisi and the Shaws are waiting to hear from Albany. Pia Peterson, Columbia Radio News.
While one New York town grapples with the consequences of a nuclear plant closing, there are larger issues with the state's outdated energy grid. There's a big piece in the New York Times today about how New York City gets its power. I spoke with journalist Emily Rube, who wrote the story, and asked her about the state's sprawling energy system.
The power grid as we know it began here in New York City with Thomas Edison's power generating station down on Pearl Street, and now it's considered the largest machine in the world.
And what are some of the different ways that New Yorkers get their power?
In 2015, almost half of the electricity produced in New York State came from natural gas. After that, the second highest percentage, which was about 31%, came from about 4 nuclear plants in the state. And hydropower, we have about 180 facilities throughout the state, provided about 19% in 2015.
Not a lot of that right now is coming from renewable energy, but we know that the governor is trying to push that number up. So as you were reporting this, what did you learn about what's making that difficult and what's standing in the way?
Well, the challenge is that renewable technology is getting cheaper to build, but it hasn't quite, or we just don't have the scale yet to produce the same amount of power that a nuclear plant produces. Nuclear produces an incredible amount of carbon-free electricity. So the challenge and what the governor and the state is trying to do is to bring in more wind farms. So they are, building the nation's largest wind farm, the coast of Long Island, and they're also looking to import more power. So not all of the electricity that we use is made in New York State, and some of it is produced in Canada, for example. And so they're working on building additional transmission lines to bring power down to New York State, which is not an easy task.
You talked a little bit in the piece about what a stressful job it is for these people who are operating the power grid, and they even have to undergo psych evaluations. Can you talk about what you learned about running the power grid itself?
Someone described it to me like juggling while being on a trampoline. They have to make sure that they're ready to handle whatever comes at them, whether that is a hurricane or a lightning storm or even just a really hot day when everyone's turning on their air conditioners and, transmission lines are sagging and, running into tree branches, which is surprisingly the number one enemy of the power grid.
Wow. Just the classic tree falling on the power line is still the number one obstacle.
And squirrels. I believe there was a squirrel brought down NASDAQ a couple years ago.
And you talked in the article, too, about some of the inefficiencies that are still baked into this system. Can you talk about why that is and how they're hoping to address it?
So the way that the system was originally designed is that you had these large centralized generating stations, but a lot of these power stations are standing by and they're waiting for either a heat wave or storm that could potentially knock out some of these generators that are upstate and further away from where power is needed, which in New York State is New York City. So what the state wants to do is to reduce the number of these, power plants that are sitting around by introducing more of these distributed resources like fuel cells and solar panels, and so reduce the distance that power has to travel between where it's made and where it's consumed.
That was Emily Rube, a writer for the New York Times, whose piece is out today. It's called How New York City Gets Its Electricity. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
I'm Mike Elson-Rooney.
And I'm Kristen Schwab. New York City has limited space, so developers build up. Skyscrapers can provide more housing, but that can also mean high rents. And they can limit natural light in an already crowded city. Sutton Place, a neighborhood on the Upper East Side, is fighting for a new zoning designation to keep mega towers out of its neighborhood. Kamila Kudelska reports from a town hall meeting.
Sutton Place is a quiet residential community. It's the 10 blocks that stretch from 50th to 59th east of 1st Avenue. When it comes to height, compared to some other areas of New York City, Sutton Place doesn't stand out. But Bauhaus Group, a developer, has proposed a mega tower, 5 times taller than the other buildings here. That has Jerry Rosenkrantz, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, concerned. His big beef? Just listen to how he introduces himself. And could I get your name?
Jerry Rosenkrantz. No, Jerry Rosenkrantz. Aside from the obvious height, which is a real problem, is the fact that these buildings, and a lot of them around Central Park, are blocking out the sun.
The new pencil-like building would be almost as tall as the Empire State. The zoning in the neighborhood doesn't limit the height of new construction. The last time the law was updated was 1961, which Rosenkrantz says means
we're going to have to live with shade, and that's a terrible sacrifice.
Like Rosenkrantz, a lot of residents are unhappy. That's why they have gathered today for a town hall meeting. Almost a year ago, community members and elected officials banded together and submitted a new rezoning designation for the neighborhood. The plan is complicated, but one thing it would do is create a height limit. But super tall buildings don't just cast shadows. They can also come with high rents. So the new plan would allow for more affordable housing.
The affordable housing piece is extremely important to us. We are losing affordable housing with the advent of this mega tower.
That's Lisa McCurry. She's with the East River 50s Alliance, a neighborhood organization created as a reaction to proposed mega tower developments like this one. Recently, Mayor de Blasio announced an initiative to create more affordable housing. McCurry says the proposed zoning would fit in well with the mayor's proposal.
It's a plan that's really been developed with an enormous number of factors in mind, with the idea of keeping the community plus affordable housing here in New York.
McCurry says under the proposed plan, new developments would reserve 20% of units for affordable housing. The Bauhaus development only requires 4 to 5%. City Council member Ben Kalos represents the Upper East Side. He says what he hears from his constituents.
We need affordable housing much more than we need another super scraper for billionaires.
Jerry Rosenkrantz and his neighbors hope the mayor will approve the rezoning plan. But for now, there's plenty of sun. 3 buildings have been demolished where the Bauhaus development is proposed. Kamila Kudelska, Columbia Radio News.
While developers and community members clash on the Upper East Side, community members in the Bronx are welcoming a different kind of company. New York's Silicon Alley is extending into the Bronx and offering virtual reality training. As Devin Brisky reports, its VR Academy is one of many new programs designed to train Bronx residents for careers in tech.
At Grand Concourse in the Bronx, City University of New York has a new roller coaster, or at least something that feels like one. 27-year-old Bronx native Albert Abreu puts on special glasses and slippers, then steps into a virtual reality cube. Abreu squats in a skiing position to avoid falling down. The 3D images portray a twisting track on a western red rock landscape. A new training program will teach aspiring entrepreneurs like Abreu to build virtual reality scenarios. Abreu says that these sort of opportunities haven't been available in the past.
These are all things we read about. Bloomberg, you see them in CNN. Well, I used to see them so out far, like in California or in another place but never here. And for it to be here, it's exciting.
The goal of the academy is to make Bronx's growing tech scene inclusive of neighborhood residents. Ronald Bergman is in charge of technology services at CUNY.
The Bronx is experiencing resurgences in the arts, in the media, and in technology. What we're trying to do is create opportunities for CUNY students and local residents to be able to become coders and designers.
The program joins a growing list of efforts in the Bronx to prepare local residents for careers in tech. One of these is MetaBronx, an incubator that helps local women and people of color start companies. Founder Miguel Sanchez grew up in the neighborhood. For him, the mission is a personal one.
There's this understanding that we are not supposed to be in this field, that I wanted to change. And so part of my thinking was, I need to either help train people in tech or give them that first opportunity once they are trained.
Sanchez was one of very few people in his neighborhood to find his way to computer science.
My parents brought me home one day a stolen computer when I was 10 years old. They bought it off the truck. They put it in my room, and I had to figure it out.
Sanchez went on to study graphic design and animation at community college. This was during the first .com boom. But as a young man in the Bronx, his options were limited.
As I always say, in the hood, is only two ways out, right? Music or sports, right? So the connections I had was in the music industry. So one of the record labels was making a .com. So I jumped at the chance to go work at that place. And I learned about how to make websites.
At the first few companies he worked at, Sanchez says he was the only software engineer who wasn't white.
I would go to agencies and they would send me to the mailroom, and I was a developer.
His goal is now to help other young Bronx natives develop the skills that they need to make it in tech. Sanchez says it's important for this to happen now. Bronx residents have seen how gentrification has displaced communities in other parts of the city, and real estate prices are beginning to shoot up in the Bronx too. Sanchez says tech skills will give local residents the ability to stay.
Look, this is going to happen whether you like it or not. There's one way to make sure you are able to stay here, And that is all within your power if you get into this field. And now.
Back at the VR Academy, Albert Abreu managed to not fall down while riding the virtual reality roller coaster.
How do you survive?
Abreu is applying to the Academy. In April, he could be one of a wave of Bronx natives pursuing a career in technology's newest frontier. Devin Brisky, Columbia Radio News.
Well, that does it for today's broadcast of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our foreman today was executive producer Emily Dugdale. Our senior producer, Taylor Wisner, worked with Meg Dalton and Hannah Long-Higgins.
Senior editor Sarah Gibson and assistant editor Sushmita Pathak led our copy team.
Director Camila Kerwin coordinated our studio production with Acacia O'Connor and Pia Peterson.
Our web team, Lindsay Cordica and Melissa Casares, got the stream live to the web.
Veteran radio professionals Joe Richmond, Carrie Donahue, and Sally Herships advised our staff. I'm Kristen Schwab.
And I'm Mike Elson-Rooney. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next week, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.
How many things did I make up? I said De
You made
Blasio.
up no things.
It's because I was like, I wanted to always say Bill de Blasio, and then I was like, he proposed a bill, and I was like, it's not a bill.
Bill proposed the bill.